So we're going to look at all of those settings tabs for different shapes, different objects, because we'll have different settings tabs for text, we'll have different settings tabs for our steel stitch versus our complex fill versus our satin. And then also if we were to have a run stitch, we do have a couple different settings boxes for our run stitch as well. So we're going to take a look at what those boxes are and just discuss what the options are there. So we'll keep it focused on, the very important parts, but if you guys have specific questions, definitely chat them in the chat box, okay? So I want to just start out with one of our stitch types. So I'm actually going to start with the run stitch, and then we can move on and sort of discuss what the other settings are. Whenever you have something selected, you'll see quite a few tabs at the upper right-hand corner. So we have, first, there is a design tab. Now this is where you can actually write some notes. You can put some keywords and you can even rate. Now where this is going to show up is on your run sheet. So if I write a note here and apply it, then if I go to my run sheet, I'm actually going to see a note at the very bottom. So you can write some notes like the colors will be, so-and-so. That's just for you to add some text for yourself. So it's not really a necessary function or feature to use, but it can be helpful when you're organizing things. So you can write a note there. Now the first tab that will pop up when we have our run stitch selected is we have the stitch length. We also have different types of run stitches. And so I'll give you an overview of the differences there. So the stitch length, most of the time we see the default as 3 millimeters. So what that is referring to is how far the actual needle pokes are from each other. So if we look very closely at part of this run stitch, I can see I have a couple little dots, and all of those needle punctures are 3 millimeters. So it's going to be rare that you might want to go to a shorter stitch length. That's going to be quite a few needle holes, and we really don't want to poke that many times into our fabric. There are occasions where you want your stitch length to be longer. So for example, if I change the stitch length, the actual stitch will look slightly different on my garment because my needle is jumping now every 5 millimeters instead of 3. You also have different types for your run stitch. So the standard is just going into follow the path one time. A 2-ply is actually going to repeat the entire run stitch path twice. So it's giving 2 layers of stitches. Okay, so we have our standard and then we have our 2-ply. The bean stitch is going to repeat every certain number of stitches. So you can go every 3 stitches and then the stitch will repeat. So you can see that there, bean repeats. So you can play with all of these. Now on the screen, they might not look very different when you're going between, say, the standard 2-ply and bean. But if you actually look at how the run stitch will stitch in your slow redraw, you'd be able to see a little bit there. You have a motif. So with Chroma Luxe, which is what we're using here, we have the option to create different run motifs. So this is really helpful to create some really interesting designs. We have so many options to choose from. So when you choose motif, that's going to be a stitch type that really has a pattern to it, not just a straight single line. So you can use these motifs for anything that you'd like. So can really be helpful to apply some different effects there. Projection. So when we click projection, you'll see that the pattern I drew in this zigzag, those lines are projecting. So it gives you this like very intricate sort of look. And if I did maybe a straight line projection, we can see that it's just going to sort of repeat in its same path. So projection will give you like a mirrored sort of look. Double rope and triple rope. This is where your run stitch is going to travel back and forth in sort of a zigzag motion. So a double rope, we can see here we have 2 layers of thread, and a triple rope is going to go 3 times. So this is going to also give you a different visual effect. And you can use this for some details like maybe hair or grass or anything where you need a thin stitch but still visual. So on our run stitch, we have those different options. The other pages that we have here are pretty simple. You can actually load in different fabrics if you want to see how this stitch will appear on, say, this pebbled leather. You can sort of load in some fabrics there. And really that's going to be helpful for applique designs. So you do have a couple options here, but those will just load in a piece of fabric. So we can always eliminate that and just do none. The Commands tab and the Last Transform tab, these both will show up on every stitch type because we're always going to have different commands that we can assign, and we will also always have the transform option, so that way we can make sure we change the size. So the Commands tab, we have color commands. So right now my color is purple, which is color chip number 8. And I can certainly change that to say 9 or 12 or whatever color I have on my color chip menu, and it will change the color there. So our commands include color. It includes starting and ending commands. This is where we could add in a trim. And we do have different tie-in and tie-offs. So that's just referring to the actual knot that we would see on our stitch. So if I were to take a look closer here at the end of this run stitch, so I'm looking at the very end, and I'm going to say the tie-off should be triangle. So if we zoom in here, oops, you can see we have a triangle knot there. So the basic is just going to be very straight. A triangle will be in a little triangle. So that's just for different types of ending positions. The transform box, we have our height and width. So we can change the size of this object. And we can also change the positioning, and that's just going to refer to the position on the page, really. So you can change the position there, and I can give you an example. If I change the Y position, it's actually changing the position of that object. So as I'm changing here, the X position is going to then move. So that's just another way of moving the object. It's very advanced, so again, that's why we're talking about some advanced settings, but you can really position something a certain distance away from your center point there. Under the transform box, you do have your mirror and flip. And so flip will just flip over the horizontal, and mirror will flip over the vertical. So that's just our run stitch. So we're going to go through all of the other tabs just for different stitch types. So the run stitch, again, we have different stitch types. We can change that stitch length. You can actually load in some fabric. You can change some of the commands here. The main ones here would be adding in, say, a trim as an end command, and if necessary, changing the tie-in and tie-off. But usually you can leave it at the default and it will be pretty secure, so you won't have to worry about that. The transform box, changing that size and positioning. So let's move on to the complex fill stitch type. So you can see that I do have quite a few extra tabs that popped up for this stitch type. So the first one is that same design tab where we can type in a note and that will pop up on our run sheet. So the design tab is referring to the entire design that you have on the screen. So you can, of course, add in some things there if you need to. The fill tab will show up on our stitch types from the complex fill to the satin. Also, the steel will have density. So the fill tab is referring to the actual fill of this object. We can see at the very top, we have different fill types. And so this is similar to, say, the run stitch, where you have a motif fill, or you have an echo, so that's going to sort of radiate through that shape. You have wave, so you have a lot of different options here where you can change the fill of that complex fill object. And that will give you some different options. So you can do emboss, that will give like a nice 3D embossed look. And underneath each fill type, you'll see your options that you have. So you'll see the emboss patterns, you'll see the motif patterns, and you have a lot to choose from. So we'll just keep it as the standard fill. And I recommend that under the standard fill, you keep it as tatami or smooth. I don't recommend to set a satin pattern fill on a complex fill. So don't choose satin pattern if your object is complex fill, because you can see here that this object is just far too large to have a satin stitch lay down. So you'll have issues there. So usually you want to just keep it as tatami. If I wanted a satin triangle, I would need to create that with a satin stitch. We have a stitch length. So we have a stitch length, and that's the same as when we looked at the run stitch. It's just referring to how far those stitches are from, how far the needle points are from each other. So leaving it at the default is generally a good idea. If we were to change the stitch length, now our needle is going to jump every 8 millimeters instead of every 3 millimeters. And if we set it lower, we have a lot more needle points, so we don't want to rip that fabric. The density is referring to how far the actual stitch is from each other. When we go lower in density, our stitches are tighter and closer together. When we go higher in density, they're farther apart. A good middle point for a complex fill shape is going to be 0.3 or 0.4, and that will give you plenty of coverage. So I usually recommend 0.4 unless you have a very small object on a stiff piece of fabric. So you want to make sure that your fabric can hold up all of those stitches. The next tab over is our underlay. So we have various underlays for different types of stitches and different types of objects, and we're changing the underlay based off of our fabric. So we can change the underlay to something that's going to cover a lot more, like a full lattice, for fabrics that might be fluffier and need more coverage. You'll have different underlay options for your satin. So you can see some of these are blurred out, and those are for satin stitches only. So your underlays, usually you can just keep that as the default, but when you are working with different fabrics or different stitch types, you might want to change it. So if you look at satin lettering with small lettering, usually a center line underlay is going to be a good option so that your underlay doesn't poke out from your top stitches. So underneath the underlay tab, you have the underlay density, the stitch length, that's the stitch length of the underlay, the run stitch length. So the run stitch is what actually goes down very first, and then your underlay will begin to stitch out. And inset is referring to how far the underlay is inset from the edge of your shape. Okay, so sorry about that. So the underlay, we have different options for different objects, and we want to make sure that we have the right underlay chosen for the right material. So you can find lots of information on this, and you can always ask questions if you're working with a specific material and you're not sure what sort of underlay to choose there. Okay. Now, the push-pull compensation. So this is a feature that we really want to make sure we are utilizing, and we want to make sure that we can understand what this actually is. So when we have push-pull compensation, we are referring to how the material of our garment is going to be pulled by our stitches, or how our stitches are actually going to push on each other. So let me give you guys a really good example, and we're actually going to look at the satin stitch instead, just for this setting tab. So if I have a satin column here, and if I have a duplicate, so we'll have two satin columns. Now, when we have our stitches go down onto our garment, and this even works with a complex fill, the stitches are going to pull a bit on the garment. So the satin column here, it might end up looking more like this after it stitches out. It might actually look a lot thinner than what we saw on the screen. And you guys might have noticed this when, say, you have a border around an object, or just in general when you have some lettering and it appears a lot thinner. The stitches are pulling from left to right, so it appears to shrink. Now, the other thing is we have push. So the stitches are actually pushing on each other on the vertical, and so our column might then end up looking like that, where it's longer than what we see on the screen. So if we actually add push and pull compensation, I'm going to make these two columns actually appear identical. So the first one is we're going to add in pull compensation. So when we compensate for the pulling of the fabric, we're actually overextending the borders of that column. And you can see, if I just go back and forth, how I have a thinner column. If I add in 130% pull comp, it's going to be a lot thicker. The push compensation is where we actually are going to shrink down the column so that the stitches, when they push on each other, then it doesn't actually end up looking a lot longer than it is. So you can see there I added push compensation, and it's actually going to shrink that column down. So as I add even more, we can really see that column shrink down. So the columns, although they were different initially, now they appear to be the same, correct? So push-pull compensation is used when we have materials that might be stretching a little bit, or even when we have a complex fill shape, the stitches are going to pull and the shape might end up looking a lot thinner. So push-pull compensation can be added. Most of the time we use it on satin, but if you have, say, a circle of complex fill stitches, it might end up looking more like an oval on your garment because those stitches are pulling in one direction and it's going to shrink. So you can add pull compensation in a percentage, and that just means you're adding in, say, an extra 20 or 30% of an extension. You can add push compensation in an absolute value, so entering in an actual number there in millimeters. And you can see on your screen how it will slightly change. So we have the next option, which is jagged type, and this is actually going to give you like a different corner style. So jagged type, it just means that it's giving, say, one side or both sides of the object a really jagged finish. So you can see that there, I added jagged type on both sides, and I added 5 millimeters. So it's just alternating in lengths, and you can see the jagged edge. You can use this for special types of area where you need it to have that sort of jagged look. You can really make a lot of very stylistic designs with this function. Okay, so jagged type, you can use that on complex fill or satin, and it'll just give you a little jagged edge. So you can use this for, say, you need to make some grass, you can add a jagged type. Okay. The other option below, where it says split satin, this is going to allow you to split a satin stitch in half so that you can get a much wider satin stitch. if you know that satin stitches need to be a certain, can only go up to a certain width, then you can see there, since the satin stitch is a lot wider, it's not filling in all the way, and what I need to do is actually split the satin so that I can have more anchor points in the middle of this column. So if we split it by percentage, we can do, say, 50-50, and we can have a nice split down the middle. We can do 30%, which I did prior, and we have now it's segmented into 3 sections. You can also do a random split, and it will just split it randomly down the middle. So that allows you to get a satin stitch that is a lot wider than what you can normally go with. So as you guys have questions, feel free to chat them. If I'm skipping over something, just let me know that you have a question about that. So the next option that we have is our connection. So the connection is referring to the corner of a stitch. So when we look at this shape here, if we zoom in very far on the corner here, we have different connection types. So usually it's a chiseled connection where you can see it's a little bit of a triangle, but it curves inwards. The next connection type is a square. So this is actually adding in a couple extra stitches, and we have a nice clean square corner type. So you have chiseled, you have square, and that's just referring to the corner and how that stitch is going to kind of travel back. Under this same tab, we have gradient. So under gradient, we can actually create a gradient effect on one object. So now these stitches are really traveling up and becoming a lot wider at the top, or vice versa. So you can create a gradient on that shape there. Now the next tab over is where we can actually blend colors together. So on the general tab, we can create a gradient of just that one color. The next tab is where we can actually add a second color layer. So we can add in some yellow to the orange, and now it's blended together. We can also create a gradient effect if we choose the gradient option. And so now the yellow is a lot thicker at the bottom, and it moves up and becomes wider at the top. You can add a third color layer, so I could even blend more than 2 colors, and now I have something that's very much blended together, and we can create a very cool effect here. So as you blend and create gradients, you can adjust the minimum and maximum density to get a different effect. So if I wanted to do minimum density of 0.5 millimeters and maximum at 5, then I have more space at one end and a lot less at the other. So the blend tool can also be used on a satin stitch. So when you're creating a satin column, you can certainly blend multiple colors together. You still have that same option, and you can just select the color that you want to blend, and then you can choose if you want it to be gradient or not, and you'll be able to play with the densities again. So the last 2 boxes we did touch on already, and that's going to be the commands box as well as the transform box. And so these are just for changing the size or the location of that object, or changing, say, the color of the initial stitch or adding in an end command as, say, a trim, or changing our tie-in and tie-off if necessary. So there are two different stitch types that we didn't look at just yet, and one of them is this yellow stitch. And all that we have that is different is we actually have a steel tab. So this is our steel stitch. The way that we create this stitch is we are clicking on our steel, and we're just drawing anywhere on the screen, and it creates what looks like a satin, but it's more of an open shape. So the steel stitch, we just have a couple extra settings like the width of it. So we can actually change the width of a steel to be a lot thicker or thinner. And then we can also change the density. So if we want the density to be a little bit lower or higher, and then we can change the angle, and that's going to be the angle of the stitch. So if I change it, those stitches are now a little bit angled instead of just straight across. We have different corner types. So if we have an extended corner type, that's just a pointy. And if we have square, it's just going to look very stiff and square like this here. So that's our steel stitch setting box, and you'll see that pop up just in the front. The other is we have our text settings. So all of the same settings options here for text, except we do have that very first tab. And this is where we change our font. This is where we change the size or the spacing in between letters. We can also change the order. So we have all of our text specific settings here. And the other option that pops up is under the commands tab, and now we just have our text commands, which is where we can add in trims in between all of the characters. We can also color change in between characters if we want to be able to choose many different colors. So just a couple extra things that will show up on your screen. And when we choose colors, when they're all different on the font here, it doesn't matter that this is green, orange, yellow, lime, brown. On the machine doesn't know that the file looks like this. It just knows that every letter is able to be a different color. So these colors don't matter. All I need to know is that I can choose something different for each individual letter. So I could set this to be the A as black, then white, then black, then white, and so on. I don't have to worry that they're rainbow. So we did have a question pop up about, are you selecting the colors or does the machine select for you? You are always entering in the colors that you want to use on the machine. So the machine doesn't actually know what colors you want. You have to type those in. So that's why it doesn't quite matter what you see on the screen. You just need to know that you're able to choose different colors for each. So what other questions do you guys have on any of those settings tabs? Have you guys used any of them? Have you changed any of those settings? So I know we went through quite a bit. My recommendation is really to just do what I did on the screen, where I created a couple different shapes, and you can really just play with all of these settings and see how it changes everything. So you can set some different options, just type in some values. You can play with all of these. You can try blending and changing the connection. You can transform, of course, but it's always helpful just to see on the screen how all of these are changing your shapes. And then, of course, you can always test out some objects, like if you make a gradient like this, you can put that onto your machine and just stitch out just a random triangle just to see how it looks. It's a lot of trial and error and just playing around with these options. We're always here to answer any specific questions you have throughout the week. So in between webinars, you can send us an email, service@chroma.com, and you will be able to view this recorded webinar in your portal after the class. So we had a question that was, when you auto digitize, is it best to leave the settings as they are? So it really depends. I like to stick away from the auto digitizer because it's just a helpful tool. It's not going to create your file perfectly. You will definitely have to make lots of edits. The auto digitizer works best with your vector files. If it's a PNG or a JPEG, you really want to make sure that it's a nice, clean, crisp image, solid colors, and clean lines. But it really depends on what your design is and what material you're putting it on. So if you auto digitize something, it's hard to say if you need to make edits or not, because I would have to see the actual file and know what material you're going to put that on, what the scale is, and some other information. Generally, what the default comes up as should be good to go. When you're just digitizing manually, the default settings are fine to just keep as is. You're really going to want to make sure you check on the density. So depending on your fabric and the type of stitch, just look at the density and see if that might be right for you. Usually a satin should be about 0.3 and a complex fill should be about 0.4.